Welcome to Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Mark Levine, and I represent City Council District 7, which includes parts of Washington Heights, West Harlem, and the Upper West Side. Affordable housing is one of the most pressing concerns in New York City today. We'll focus on this key issue today, looking at the impact of affordable housing, including the availability of civil legal services and housing court, and succession of rent control and rent-regulated apartments. To discuss these issues further, I'm pleased to welcome Rodrigo Sanchez Camus, supervising attorney at Northern Manhattan Improvement Corporation, Adrian Holder, attorney in charge at the Legal Aid Society, Civil Practice, and Larry Wood, community organizer at Goddard Riverside Community Center. Thank you all for joining me. We brought in the big guns, the big brains.
Thank you.
Start us off, Adrian. It seems today that tenants are under more pressure than ever, and more pressure in Manhattan than anywhere else. Why is that? What's going on?
I mean, it's an affordability crisis. And so when we talk about tenants and we're talking about what's going on in New York City, what we're talking about is the fact that New York City really has become this tale of two cities. It's the best of times for certain New Yorkers, and it's the worst of times for others. And what we're finding is that for low income and even working class and middle income New Yorkers, there's a real affordability gap. And we see this in rental housing, and you see it even for people who think that they can or they want to enter into a buyer's market. And so it's tough. And I think that there's a lot of promise, however, that it can get better. And that's why I think a lot of us are feeling a little bit encouraged, because for decades a lot of us have fought on these issues, but there is an opportunity with the strengthening of the rent laws. There's an opportunity with a visionary city council and council members such as yourself, and with our new mayor, where they see that there's these inequities and there's these problems, but they can be corrected. And so the idea that we're going to develop affordable housing, but also knowing that we can't build our way out of the problem, that we can also preserve affordable housing and look at folks' rights and make sure that they know what their rights are to be able to stay here. And strengthening the rent laws and the protections that are available, all of those things are going to go a long way. And if there's legislation to also help people fight to preserve their housing in housing court or other forums, that is going to go a long way to stabilizing what we see as the crisis. It's a real opportunity, and I'm really happy that we're here today together as a community of advocates and organizers to be able to do that with our elected officials.
And we're going to talk about some of the policy push that we're undertaking in the council at the state level. But you all are on the front lines of serving individual tenants as well, day to day. That's critical to helping keep regular New Yorkers, regular Manhattanites in their apartment. Right. So Rodrigo, tell us about what's coming through your doors at Northern Manhattan Improvement Corp. What are you seeing as the biggest problems facing tenants, and how can tenants deal with them?
Obviously, following up on what Adrian said, affordability is one of the major issues. Unfortunately, there's little we can do about that. We do try to help as many tenants that come through our door as possible. One of the big issues that we see are issues around succession, and it's possibly one of the most frustrating things for us, because there are rules around succession in rent-regulated housing. For example, in a rent-stabilized apartment, you have to have lived with the tenant of record for 2 years, and you have to have lived together there, and then the tenant of record has to tell the landlord that they're vacating in order for you to request your succession rights. Too many times what we're seeing is families are not telling the landlord, and the tenant of record either passes away or vacates for another reason, and they never inform the landlord. And 5, 6 years down the line, the landlord finds out. And what the law says is that you have to show 2 years of co-residency from the moment that the landlord finds out that the tenant of record is no longer there. When you leave 5 years earlier and never alert the landlord, now you're going to have a problem establishing those 2 years of co-residency, since the landlord found out at a moment where the tenant of record has been out for over 2 years. And so this is one of the most frustrating things for us, and I feel like it's one of the things the community can solve. It's one of the real areas where if folks know what their rights are and just stand up and tell a landlord, they can preserve their affordable housing. So that's one of the big issues we would like the community to know about, and to start engaging in making sure that when the tenant of record vacates, that they alert the landlord, and that they alert the landlord in writing. That's very important, because many times, as I'm sure Adrian has seen with clients going to legal aid, that clients tell the landlord verbally, and the landlord will say that they never knew about this. And so what we recommend is that people send certified letters so that they can prove that they notified the landlord in writing, so that they can preserve their succession rights. If the landlord refuses to give you a lease at that point and says, keep paying in the other person's name, you shouldn't do that. But if you did, at a bare minimum, you've established your right to succession at that point by sending something in writing.
Yep. You're proving just how complicated housing law is. Larry, do you have to have an attorney to win a fight like this? Where do people go for help? Should they even take this on alone?
Well, ideally, you want to have an attorney. There's not a right to counsel in civil court, and that's a campaign that many of us have been working on and fighting for. Actually, Adrian and I serve on the board of an organization called Housing Court Answers, formerly known as the Citywide Task Force on Housing Court. It formed on the 10th anniversary of the forming of Housing Court, and advocates recognized Housing Court at that point had become a rent collection agency and largely an eviction mill. It's also supposed to be a place where you can actually get justice and have code enforcement and maintenance of your building addressed, but it had largely fallen down on that job. So there's many of us been working for decades on trying to establish a right to counsel. And just to echo the tale of two cities, it's the worst of times and the best of times. It is a really grim situation in New York City now. Every week we seem to set a new record for the numbers of people in the shelter system, currently over 60,000. Hundreds of thousands of families are paying really extremely high rent burdens, 40, 50% or more to hang on to their affordable housing. But it's also the best of times because there's a lot of activism underway. There's a lot of coalitions out there addressing homeless issues, housing production, and housing preservation. So it is an opportunity time to get involved. And as Adrian said, we have a good progressive city council. We have a mayor who cares. But we also have to go to Albany to deal with a lot of issues around the rent laws. So there's a lot of activity underway. And I guess later on I'll be sharing how people could get involved, what coalitions to call. We have rallies coming up. It's also the season for the Rent Guidelines Board. They had a preliminary vote the other day. There's a range being proposed from zero, a rent freeze, which we're going to be fighting hard for, to rent increases, which the data doesn't support the notion of rent increases. Landlords are doing quite well in this city. They're making great rate of returns on their buildings, and now is the time for a rent freeze to really protect these buildings.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. There's so many great campaigns going on right now, one of which is to establish a right to counsel in housing court. And in the City Council, we have a great bill,
Yes.
Intro 214, that would establish that for low-income tenants.
And you're the chief sponsor.
Well, as it so happens, I am. Thank you very much. Happy to be joined by 35 of my colleagues in the council, and the wonderful Vanessa Gibson is my partner in leading this effort. Adrian, what's at stake here? What's at stake for the city in this fight to establish a right to counsel in housing court?
There's so much at stake. I think when you look at what's happening in housing court and when you look at the folks who are harmed, I mean, there's real possibilities here. I want to make sure, sometimes when we talk about these issues, people want to say, oh, it's really an issue about creating better jobs, and oh, it's really just an issue of the fact that people are getting squeezed out and we just need to figure out additional subsidies. What I like and what's going on is that people realize that it's a combination of all of those things coming together, as well as the fact that there are a lot of rights that tenants have that when they don't have counsel, they are not able to exercise in housing court. The idea that people can actually exercise their rights, and especially people who have rent-regulated or in rent-regulated apartments, and all of the protections. Rent regulation is not just about affordability, but it's about habitability, so that's the preservation of units, and it's also about protections and rights of renewal and being able to stay. When folks can really exercise those rights, we're going to see that there's going to be the preservation of affordable units and of our residents. And New York City loses out when people have to move out of this city, when people move farther and farther away from schools and from vibrant areas that, quite frankly, many of them helped to create and remain vibrant, but they don't sometimes get the opportunity to be able to live in those same neighborhoods that they've invested for generations. But when people get moved out, we all lose, because the strength of New York City is the fact that we are so diverse. We're diverse not only in terms of race, but also because of economic and different types of immigrant backgrounds, because of professions. And, you know, the economies of New York working together is what makes the city perform. And from the moment, you know, we walk out of our house, what I've always loved is that you can see that diversity of profession as well as of person. And the city losing that means that the city is going to be quite one-dimensional, and it won't be able to sustain its place worldwide as being this wonderful cultural and economic and social mecca. And I think, you know, I've always said this, and anyone who knows me knows that I truly believe that we all do this work because we know that when folks who have the least are doing better, we actually all do better. So when people try to say that we're so wonderful and, you know, and they try to thank everyone for doing this work and that we're making these great sacrifices as lawyers or organizers or advocates or policy people to do this work on behalf of low income, I'm like, no, it's a selfish thing. I live in Central Harlem, and when my neighbors are doing better, I'm doing quite well, thank you. And, you know, my neighborhood is thriving. And so that's why we do this work, and that's why that so much is at stake. But in housing court, you can really make a difference because there's so many people who get evicted but don't have to have been evicted if they had known their rights and been able to really present those in this complicated web of rent laws that we have.
And this really epidemic of eviction, which now numbers more than 25,000 a year,
Yes.
and it's been growing steadily, it's feeding what is really the biggest crisis in New York City today, which is homelessness.
Yes.
We're now seeing many nights more than 60,000 people in our shelters, and many of them are children, 25,000 on average. And the number one source of their homelessness is eviction. So what might seem like an obscure arena in housing court is affecting the city in just a terrible way.
Yes.
That's why we're working so hard to bring justice to that arena. Yes, go ahead.
I was just going to follow up on how important the right to counsel is to that.
Yes.
It's such a central piece to that because when you go to housing court, I would venture to guess, and Larry might have better numbers, but I would venture to guess more than 90% of tenants are unrepresented, while you have the flip for landlords, more than 90% of landlords are represented. And what you see and what we see at Northern Manhattan Improvement Corporation is that we see a lot of tenants come in with legal papers that present no real basis for their eviction. Legal notices saying, we don't believe you live in the apartment, without a single fact behind this allegation. But the people oftentimes are scared. They've gotten legal papers. They don't know what to do. And we can serve a certain amount of people. We have 6 attorneys doing housing, but we are one of the main agencies in Upper Manhattan that is doing this. There's a lot more people than we can possibly serve. And so this is one of the issues. When people come in with these court papers that really, if an attorney intervened, there's absolutely no way that the landlord could move forward with this eviction. But since they're not getting sufficient representation, I don't know how many of these evictions are possibly because of cases that didn't really have a foundation, that if the person had gotten representation, would have been able to put up a fight in this eviction and preserve their affordable housing.
Yeah, and the most unscrupulous landlords know this.
Exactly.
And they're gaming the system, and they're hauling people into housing court because in most cases there'll be no attorney on the other side.
Exactly.
And we hear cases, I'm sure you've seen it, where if a lawyer shows up with the tenant, then magically the landlord drops the case. They weren't planning on that.
I have examples of people who've come into our open intake. We have open intake 2 days a week, where I have literally called the landlord's attorney on the papers and said, what are you doing? And they've told me, I'll send you a notice to discontinue the case. With one phone call.
Terrible.
And so this is what I'm saying is if people had access to these services, we would go a long way towards preserving affordable housing.
Even judges are crying out. It's incredible. Many have privately told me that they're often aghast at what they see in their courtroom in housing court. They're not allowed to suggest strategies to the tenant. They're supposed to be impartial, but even they see it, and that's a pretty strong indication of just how bad things are. Absolutely. You know, most of these evictions, I think over half, are occurring in rent-regulated apartments. And we know what happens when those apartments become vacant. Often they go market rate. So this is feeding really an affordable housing crisis here. Larry, talk to us about the erosion of what really has been the central pillar of affordable housing in New York, which has been rent regulation. How serious is that, and what direction are we heading in?
Well, you're absolutely right. If somebody is displaced and evicted in an SRO unit or an apartment in Manhattan, the sky's the limits with the rent. That's one of the things we're trying to fight in strengthening the rent laws is repeal of vacancy decontrol. Because as long as landlords know there's a windfall to be made by displacing somebody, we all have a price tags on our back. And I'm just reminded, we're working last week, we have a rooming house in Harlem, 110 West 130th Street. And we put in answers for some of the tenants, our attorneys up here. And it is a real triage issue, who can you help and who you can't help. The landlord's attorney said, oh, we didn't think they would answer. And they were immediately ready to drop the case. One gentleman had been living there for decades, a jazz musician. They brought papers, a holdover proceeding, calling him a squatter. And then they switched it into a non-payment action. It's not even legal process, but they just didn't think people would have their act together to answer. The poor gentleman has dialysis 3 days a week. It was a struggle for him to come into the office. So it's just horrendous, the pressure and some of the things that happens. Our office works with single-room occupancy hotel tenants throughout Manhattan, and they're some of the most vulnerable tenants. And we've lost, in 1971, it was 165,000 units of SRO housing. In 1986, 15 years later, there was 65,000 left. There's probably about 45,000 left in the city. And a lot of them are in Community Board 4 and 7, concentrated on the Upper West Side, these big hotels. And then we have a lot of rooming houses throughout Harlem and Chelsea. And they tend to be very vulnerable tenants. And we've done our best to try to preserve those tenancies and those rights. They get converted back into 1 or 2 family houses, converted into co-ops or condos. The displacement pressure is incredible.
Yeah.
But for people to get involved, the Real Rent Reform Campaign, the Alliance for Tenant Power, Met Council on Housing, Tenants and Neighbors, they're leading these coalitions to try to strengthen the rent laws. A right to Right to Counsel. We have righttocouncilnyc.org. Go to that website. Google Met Council on Housing, Tenants and Neighbors. You can get to the websites of these tenant organizations who are leading the charge in these coalitions, because we need people to get involved. We have trips to Albany coming up, May 27th, a big action. We're going to be in the Capitol. We need to send a strong message to Governor Cuomo. He's come out recently saying it's very important we renew the rent laws. He's wrong. We have to strengthen the rent laws. Preserving the rent laws as is what the landlords want, because they currently contain the seeds of their own destruction as long as vacancy decontrol is in place. So people, you have to call the governor and tell him it's unacceptable to renew the rent laws as is. And we're going to be sending him a strong message on May 27th, and I welcome people to join us in doing that.
It's clear that just a straight renewal of the rent laws, I mean, I want people to really understand how dramatic this is. A straight renewal of the rent laws, of the status quo, will result in the loss of rent regulation in 20 years. Like, it is clear with the statistics of the number of units that we're losing that we will no longer have rent-regulated apartments.
Because of the vacancy decontrol loophole.
Right, and the vacancy decontrol, to make sure that folks understand what we're talking about, that means that upon vacature, a landlord, if he, right away, automatically in the law, is a 20% vacancy increase that you're allowed to take without doing anything. So as soon as an apartment becomes vacant, landlords legally are allowed to raise the rent by 20%. On top of that, if they do any improvements, which a lot of times we know is actually just maintenance, right? But anything that they want to key as an improvement, they go ahead and they go into the apartment, and then they can raise the rent as much as long as they get it over $2,500 a month, then that unit now is forever lost. In terms of a rent-regulated pool. That's what we're talking about. And for other people who may not really understand what's going on in Manhattan, because maybe they've been in place for years, or maybe they're owners and they live in co-ops or condos or whatever, what folks don't understand is that it is not uncommon in Central Harlem, in the South Bronx, in East New York, to find apartments that are anywhere from $1,500 to $3,000 a month for 1-bedroom apartments. So what we're talking about is that there's a real affordability crisis, but some of these apartments were moved out of rent regulation, or the rents have been increased illegally. And so what we're talking about is strengthening, all of these issues are all intertwined. Strengthening of the rent law so that we don't have to continue to bleed out of these protected units. But then in addition to that, and the strengthening of that, it's the idea that with a right to counsel, or with folks having, more advocates who can really inform them of their rights, that we're also going to create a real presence for our neighborhoods, that they know that they can stay and they can assert those rights to maintaining affordability and their placement in the communities.
In Manhattan, we've lost 100,000 rent-regulated apartments in the last decade. So
Yes.
all this work that in the Bloomberg area they did to build new affordable housing was more than undone by the loss, sort of a quiet crisis.
Right.
But on net, we slid backwards
Yes.
in that era, and we got to make sure that doesn't happen again.
I just want to follow up a little bit on this issue of decontrol. You are allowed to make a challenge of what your rent is, and so people should request from HCR a rent registration history, because this would allow them to see what the prior tenant paid. One of the phenomenons we're seeing, which is very unfortunate, is that landlords are giving preferential rents without explaining to the tenant what the legal regulated rent actually is. And so landlords are trying to circumvent a 4-year rule because you have 4 years basically to challenge the rent, and they give a preferential rent, and at the end of those 4 years, they do your lease renewal and say, by the way, the legal regulated rent is X. And now you've passed the 4 years in which to challenge it. So as a very practical thing, I think all tenants moving into an apartment should request
do you
their
do
rent
that?
registration. You can go to HCR's website, the Housing and Community Renewal.
The state agency.
It's a state agency that manages rent registrations in the city. It's easily obtainable online, and they will send you, actually you don't even need to go in. If you call them, they will send a rent registration history to your apartment. They will mail it, so you don't even have to go anywhere. All you need to do is make a phone call, request it, and it will be mailed to you, and you'll be able to examine the rental history of the apartment
But
to
if you wanted to go
determine
in-
if you had a challenge. But if you wanted to go in, there are borough offices. There's the main office in the state office building at 125th Street, but there are also borough offices in the Bronx and Queens. So it is accessible to tenants, and tenants should use this as a means to challenge these rents.
And it's important for folks to ask for the registration back to 1984 when it was initiated. Sometimes the agency will just give you the last 4 years and you don't get the whole picture. So for market rate tenants who are moving into an apartment and paying top dollar, you need to go to HCR, get your rent history, and see what the rent was last year or 2 years ago, because there could be an overcharge. You could do it anonymously. Get the information, go to a tenant organization, get information about how you would challenge this, be informed, because you might be able to get your rent rolled back to a legal rate and live a lot more affordably. So it's very important for those market rate tenants to learn that, because that's a unit we could possibly get regulated once again.
Yep. So Adrian, the majority of New York City residents are tenants, actually. I would think that's a very large voting bloc, and I would think that would win the day in Albany. Yet it's been a very tough slog for tenants and tenant advocates in Albany. How can that be? Is democracy not working?
Oh, that's a great question, council member.
A leading question.
I think it really is just about making sure that we get the word out and we get folks organized. There's some powerful forces, and on public access channels, you can get some really great information. But there's major networks that have Rent Stabilization Association, and RIBNY, which represents landlords, and they have major campaigns promoting, what I would say, in my opinion, is misinformation about what the rent laws really do. And so when you're up against such big money forces, that's what the problem becomes, because you're right, there's majority renters here. And when you're talking about strengthening, it's a state action that's needed, and so we're so lucky that we have state legislators from the city who are really trying to be strident on this issue. But it takes a lot. It takes a lot, and it really is something that really impacts the city more. But this year, I'm optimistic, and we know that the mayor and the governor stood about a week and a half ago together on the strengthening of the rent laws, and I'm really optimistic that we're going to be able to get something pushed through. But you're right, New York City definitely a city city of renters.
I want to be a little more blunt. The real estate industry buys undue influence in Albany. Through campaign contributions, they have a lot of weight up there. We're trying to close a very important loophole of limited liability corporations, LLCs. A landlord can magnify what they can contribute to candidates and to elected officials by, they can incorporate each building as an LLC and give a donation from each LLC. It buys a lot of influence. We have a Senate controlled by the Republicans, and they largely represent the outer suburbs, upstate New York. They get a lot of money from the real estate industry, and that's helped them maintain their slight majority. A lot of money goes to our governor as well as the assembly. There's going to be some sort of horse trading. We know the assembly, who's controlled by the Democrats, have many bills to strengthen the rent laws. But there's other things that the real estate industry and the governor wants. Property tax cap statewide, a renewal of 421A, which is a tax subsidy, a tax abatement program to encourage development. Many of us believe it's a wasteful use of money. It's subsidized luxury development and those big towers going up in Midtown Manhattan. It's an abomination. It needs to be eliminated.
And it costs the city millions of dollars. It's a huge investment of city dollars.
So for us to win something this year,
Right.
They call it the big ugly. At the end of the legislative session, there'll be some deal making, and there's a lot of issues in play. Mayoral control of the schools, the DREAM Act. There's lots of things, and there'll be some sort of deal made. We want stronger rent laws. We know the governor and the Senate Republicans want certain things. They're going to have to really bang their heads together and figure it out. So we have some leverage, and we're very hopeful we can win this year.
We're almost out of time.
Okay.
But I want to make the point that tenants are more organized than ever.
Yes, they are.
And we have
need to participate. Need to go to the
and
May
we need
27th
everyone
event in
who
Albany.
cares about this issue, whether a tenant or an ally of tenants, to step up now. This is game time. Between now and the end of June, there is so much at stake for tenants. No one can afford to sit this out. So we're out of time, but this was an incredibly informative discussion. I hope it inspired our viewers.
Thank you.
And I hope you'll come back to talk about this topic in the future. I want to thank Rodrigo, Adrienne, and Larry for joining me and offering your perspective on the housing issues facing New York City that we discussed today. If you'd like to keep the conversation going on these or other important issues, or if you have questions or concerns, you can reach out to my office at 212-928-6814 or email us at district7@council.nyc.gov. I'm City Council Member Mark Levine. Thanks for watching Represent NYC of Manhattan Neighborhood Network.